Urartian settlements, especially the fortified centres, were almost entirely new foundations. Even when built near earlier prehistoric sites, these locations show no architectural continuity with what came before. The Urartians did not inherit cities, they created them. This pattern suggests a deliberate and conscious approach to regional planning. Settlements were not placed randomly but chosen with attention to agriculture, animal husbandry, defence, and religious significance. The process appears to have begun at central hubs, gradually extending outward, valley by valley, as newly controlled territories were reshaped and integrated. One of the most striking examples of this transformation can be seen at the northern edge of Lake Van, where the Ben Demahi River enters the plain. Here, the landscape bears clear signs of intensive planning and large-scale intervention. Written records from the reigns of early Urartian kings repeatedly refer to coordinated efforts in regional organisation and city building in this area. These texts describe places that had previously been empty and undeveloped, now reshaped through construction, cultivation, and fortification. A recurring royal inscription tells of a ruler who, empowered by the chief god, established a fortified gate, built a new stronghold, planted vineyards, and laid out gardens for vegetables and fruit in a location where nothing had existed before. The emphasis is not on conquest alone, but on transformation. Land was drained, reshaped, and made productive. Marshes were converted into farmland, water was controlled and redirected, and defensive structures rose above newly reclaimed plains. The plain near modern Muradia offers a vivid illustration of this process. Surrounded by natural hills crowned with fortresses, the area today gives little indication that it was once a marshy basin lying below the lake's natural water level. Yet geological and archaeological evidence suggests that, before Urartian intervention, the land was largely unusable. Only after extensive water management projects did it become suitable for settlement and agriculture. Fortresses, towns, vineyards, and gardens appeared as part of a unified vision, rather than isolated efforts. These developments were not limited to one reign. Later, rulers continued and expanded the work, extending planned settlement into new regions such as the Araz Plain. The evidence points to a methodical strategy. Land was surveyed, water systems established, fortifications erected, and populations relocated. Agriculture followed, supported by carefully controlled irrigation. What emerged was not a loose collection of strongholds, but an interconnected landscape shaped by deliberate policy. The most ambitious expression of this planning can be seen in the region surrounding the capital. Long before later traditions embellished its origins, the area already bore the marks of large-scale urban design. Later, historical narratives, though framed in legendary language, describe features that closely match the physical remains still visible today. They speak of canals cut through rock, of water brought from distant sources, of palaces rising above the plain, and of gardens spreading across the city. These accounts describe a city organized by function and movement. Water flowed through channels into cultivated areas, sustaining orchards and fields. Residential quarters were separated by streets and open spaces. Defensive walls enclosed key areas, while monumental structures dominated the highest ground. At the city's edge stood an elevated complex, both palace and prison, isolated and difficult to access, symbolizing authority and control. Rock-cut chambers, storage spaces, and sanctuaries were carved directly into the cliffs. Inscriptions were engraved onto hard stone surfaces, with precision that astonished later observers. Similar inscribed markers appeared across the region, defining borders and asserting royal presence. These were not isolated gestures, but part of a broader effort to inscribe power onto the landscape itself. When viewed through a critical archaeological lens, these descriptions align closely with the physical remains of Urartu. The cliffs, walls, rock chambers, canals, and scattered inscribed stones all correspond to what has been uncovered through fieldwork. What appears in later narratives as legend often reads instead like an eyewitness account of large-scale construction and planning. Central to this transformation was water management. The canal system built during this period remains in use even today, still supplying water to gardens and fields. Its course can be followed across the terrain, cut into rock and supported by massive stone structures. Along its length, inscriptions carved into the stone record its construction and purpose. These markings remain visible, silent witnesses to a project that reshaped the land and sustained life across generations. The source that feeds water into this canal lies south of Van, in the valley of the Hoshab River. In older regional tradition, this valley was known by a different name, often translated as the Valley of the Armenians. The spring begins by flowing in the opposite direction along a higher line of ground, almost as if it is testing the landscape before turning toward its real destination. After roughly 2 kilometers, it crosses the Hoshab riverbed by means of a stone water bridge, then continues onward in the direction of Van. Near the crossing point, traces of earlier retaining walls can still be noticed. From there, the canal takes on a clear form, a channel about 4.5 meters wide and around 1.5 meters deep. It clings to the mountain slope, following a high contour line close to 1,800 meters above sea level, then gradually loses height with a steady, controlled gradient. After a long run of roughly 50 kilometers, the waterline reaches the level of Van's garden districts at around 1,750 meters. Over the final 25 kilometers, the canal runs on an embankment supported by a strong retaining wall. In the modern period, this section was partly replaced by a lower concrete channel, beginning in the mid-20th century. Yet the older line remains visible in many places. Even so, the original structure continues to suffer slow damage from time and exposure. Despite its scale, no full technical study has yet explained in detail how this canal was measured, laid out, and built. One question stands out. The canal drops with striking regularity, roughly 1 meter per kilometer. Such precision implies careful planning and reliable methods for calculating elevation, but the exact knowledge and tools behind this work remain unclear. The growth of the capital is closely tied to this water system. The city's foundation and later expansion were shaped by several forces, including military success and the movement of large populations into newly organized areas. Just as important was the problem of water itself. Lake Van is salty, so it could not serve as a practical drinking or irrigation source. Worse still, flooding along the shoreline could poison fields with salt and ruin harvests. Only a stable flow of fresh water could offset those conditions, and the canal made that possible. Similar projects appear elsewhere under the same rulers. In different regions, canals were also constructed. Yet, the agricultural purpose stands out again and again. On the northern shore of Lake Van, for example, travellers entering an otherwise dry landscape would have seen a patch of green around Ursish that looked like a living oasis. Inscriptions mention a canal there that carried water from a spring linked to a local deity, leading it toward the city. Farther west, near Malazgirt, other texts refer to an area later remembered as the Valley of Minua, suggesting additional waterworks and land organisation. North of Van, the establishment of a new administrative centre at Toprakale was likewise connected to a major irrigation system. A stone monument associated with a later king describes the creation of an artificial lake and the digging of a canal leading from that reservoir toward the new city. The text presents this not as a minor improvement, but as an act of deliberate transformation, turning land that had not been prepared into a controlled, usable space. It also speaks of assigning fields, laying out vineyards and gardens, and organizing the surrounding territory so that the settlement could function as more than a fortress. The reservoir itself sits in a difficult mountain zone east of Toprakale, near the Varak mountain range, at an elevation that makes clear how determined this effort was. Its southern embankment was built as a broad, earth-filled wall, faced without mortar. Measurements taken in modern times show a structure that is both massive and carefully engineered. Historical records of repairs and flood damage reveal that it has not remained unchanged. Modern reconstruction restored it to a substantial height, and the water release is controlled through an outlet that can be opened and closed. Calculations suggest a capacity in the tens of millions of cubic meters today, while reconstructions of the older system imply that the original reservoir could have held far more under earlier conditions. Other inscriptions from distant locations reinforce the same pattern. Whenever a new city was planned, water control was planned alongside it. In the Ararat Plain, a new settlement was established and linked to a canal drawn from a major river. The texts present farming initiatives and settlement planning as part of the same program, not as separate developments. Even outside the core territories, canals appear again. A channel fed from the Nazlu stream is mentioned near Karl Ismail Aha. At Çavuştepe, the foundation inscription on the temple facade speaks of a canal drawn from the river, known today as the Hoshab. Different sites, different rulers, yet the same underlying logic repeats. Water is brought under control, then land is reorganized around it. A clearer picture of how this planning-shaped society emerges in the best-studied example of a planned Urartian settlement in the Aras plain. The city established there expanded across a vast cultivated area, shaped by volcanic soils on one side and man-made canals on the other. Its built zone stretched for several kilometers, marked by fortified hills and inhabited land between them. Research in this region reveals not only the city itself, but also a long history beneath it. Earlier communities had lived here as far back as the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, relying on the Aras River's shifting water. Some settlements were abandoned when the river changed its course, then reoccupied centuries later. The landscape shows cycles of use, abandonment, and return long before the Urartian period. Later, eras left their own layers as well. In places that continued into classical and late antique times, settlement did not simply end after Urartu. At Armavir, for instance, habitation continued through multiple imperial periods, creating a long chain of continuity. What signals the Urartian phase most clearly, however, is the irrigation network. Several canals, together reaching a combined length of around 40 kilometers, point to an organized water system serving the settlement. One major channel can be followed for a long distance and can be dated because its stone inscription survives. It presents the canal as an act of authority. Water drawn across land described as previously uninhabited, then reshaped to support a planned community. The main city was not alone. It was surrounded by smaller settlements and protected by nearby fortresses positioned as a defensive ring. Two major fortified hills formed the core, with inhabited districts stretching between them. One of these fortified complexes, interpreted as a royal or administrative residence, has been excavated in detail. Its layout follows the shape of the hill. Its defences include projecting wall segments typical of the region, and its plan adapts to the natural rock rather than forcing a perfectly symmetrical design. Construction methods vary from other sites, using roughly shaped basalt blocks in uneven sizes. Yet the overall impression remains one of deliberate, functional building. The complex was entered through 2 gates, each leading into a structured interior. A central building with a long internal space forms the core. Rows of wooden posts once stood here on stone bases, some carrying formal inscriptions. Nearby rooms served living needs, while other sections were built for storage. The purpose of these storage areas can be inferred from the large jars found inside them, many marked with signs indicating measured volumes. The eastern side held rooms likely used to display authority and manage the region. Service spaces and barracks were part of the same system. Along the northern facade, large grain storage buildings underline the settlement's economic scale. Estimates based on storage capacity suggest that thousands of tons of grain could be kept here, along with vast quantities of wine. Religious structures were also present. Some were altered or reused in later centuries, which makes the original appearance harder to reconstruct. Yet the pattern is consistent with other Urartian centres. Temples, ritual buildings, and monumental gateways existed as part of the planned city. Even where only fragments survive, such as distinctive stone steps or foundations, the architectural language matches what is known from similar sites. Excavations in the lower urban area reveal a social landscape that was far from uniform. Simple, irregular houses appear in one outer zone, interpreted as a poorer district. Nearby, a cemetery containing modest burials and traces of burning fits the same picture. In another area, blocks of similar houses arranged around inner courtyards suggest organised housing, often interpreted as quarters for soldiers. These layouts resemble patterns seen at other fortified cities. Most of the population appears to have been made up of farmers and craft workers. The farmers' houses were sturdy but modest, built with mud brick walls set on basalt foundations, floors made of compacted earth. Tools connected to agriculture help explain how these households functioned. Storage jars in varying numbers and sizes hint at differences in wealth and production capacity between families. The plant remains recovered from the site, show a broad mix of crops, including grains, legumes, and fruit. The variety suggests not a fragile economy, but a diversified one, shaped by long-standing farming traditions. Animal bones show the expected domestic species, yet hunting also contributed, since remains of wild animals and fish appear alongside livestock. Similar patterns show up at other settlements in the region, indicating that this was not an isolated case. Craft workers, by contrast, seem to have lived closer to higher status groups. Their homes were larger, often containing more rooms, built with better materials and stronger construction. Small finds point to stoneworking, pottery production, and metalwork as active crafts. Accounts of elite housing describe residences with substantial halls, ovens, kitchens, bathing areas, and multiple storage rooms. The scale alone communicates wealth and status without needing any embellishment. All of this leads into a broader point about how these places were understood. In Urartian practice, the line between city, fortress, and palace is not always sharp. What matters most is scale, position, and function. Smaller posts, watch points, and fortified stations existed, while larger centres could serve as royal residences, administrative hubs, and defended towns at the same time. Even the terminology used in official writing tends to treat the fortified core as the defining element of the settlement. In some cases, the entire city could be spoken of as a single power centre, with the fortified complex standing as its symbolic heart. In general, the layout of Urartian fortresses was not dictated by an abstract set of architectural rules. Their plans were shaped first by the land itself, the line of the outer walls, the direction of the rock ridges, the slopes, and the natural points of access. Some strongholds were stretched along narrow, elongated rock platforms, as seen at places like Çavuştepe and Bastan. Others were planted on dramatic rocky mountains or knife-edge ridgelines, like the fortress of Van and the citadel at Toprakal. The result is an architecture that looks engineered for specific terrain rather than designed from a single standardized blueprint. Urartian fortification also shows a recognizable construction style that separates it from many neighboring traditions. Walls were often built without mortar, using massive stone blocks set tightly together. The overall impression can be blunt and powerful, yet it is not the same approach found in the polygonal stonework typical of certain other cultures. Instead of irregular multi-sided blocks, the masonry usually relies on squared and rectangular stones stacked in horizontal courses. Exceptions exist, but the dominant method is consistent. Straight runs of wall, clean lines, and a preference for stone that can be cut into strong, geometric forms. The choice of location follows the same logic. These fortresses were repeatedly placed on rocky hills that are difficult to approach and easy to defend. Their high ground was not only strategic, it also created a specific set of features that appear again and again. One of the most characteristic traces is the presence of carved, false steps on the bedrock. Some of these cuttings may mark the positions of vanished structures whose walls once sat in carved sockets. Others clearly served practical needs, such as rock-cut cisterns, like those known at Çavuştepe, or stepped tunnels that descend toward hidden water sources. Black basalt was the standard building stone across much of the Urartian heartland, creating the dark, heavy look that many sites still display. Our yet earlier phases sometimes used limestone, and nowhere is this contrast more visible than around the oldest structures at Van. Different stones and different wall styles suggest that construction changed over time, even at the same location. One early structure, often linked to the reign of the first king at the capital, stands out because it does not fit the typical later pattern. It appears unusual, and it may not have been part of the main fortress in the way later walls were. When the fortresses around Van are ordered by those that can be dated through inscriptions, a broad architectural progression becomes visible, moving from simpler forms toward more complex ones. Among the earliest candidates are sites such as Upper Zivistan and Lower Anzaf. Upper Zivistan lies on a natural hill south of Van, and it produced some of the earliest local inscriptions. One foundation text connected with the earliest royal building tradition is written in a foreign imperial language, while several other stones belong to a later ruler's independent reign. The site's best preserved element is a straight western wall, built in a rough, heavy style from limestone blocks. The original plan likely formed a rectangle, emphasizing a simple enclosed shape. The Anzaf fortress northeast of Van appears to belong to a similar phase. Its oldest text is linked to a ruler known from the earliest period, carved on a stone base. Here too the walls are plain, built from limestone blocks without prominent projections. A similar structure near Edremit, south of Van, strengthens the impression that this early style was once widespread. The presence of nearby limestone outcrops and quarry zones suggests that these locations were supplied from the same general stone sources, shaping both the material and the look of the earliest walls. Across the broader region, a site west of Lake Urmia offers another glimpse into the same transitional era. It is often linked to a period when power was shared between two rulers. Archaeological observations identify corner towers that could reach impressive widths, and the masonry again uses roughly worked limestone blocks. This can suggest an early date, although stone style alone doesn't always provide certainty. A clearer step forward appears at Kurzut, a fortress founded by a king who explicitly named the place in his inscriptions. Its walls survive up to significant heights, built from dense rows of square and rectangular basalt stones. The northern and eastern sides display protruding tower-like segments, a feature that becomes increasingly important later. In Urartian wall building, straight lines were preferred. Curving walls are rare. At the same time, walls that zigzag in response to natural obstacles appear frequently, producing a jagged outline that follows the terrain. Kurzut's northern wall is a notable exception because it bends in a way that signals a more complex relationship with the ground beneath it. The inner citadel at Van also shows these tower-like projections, forming a pattern that would become one of the most recognizable Urartian signatures. Earlier constructions associated with the first ruler at the capital, as well as the early sites linked to the next generation, do not clearly display this developed projecting style. The earliest inscription found on stones of the inner citadel belongs to the king who also built at Kurzut, and its wording closely matches a text from that site. This suggests that major building activity was underway at the capital's Acropolis during the same period. Even so, a difficult problem remains. It is not yet proven that the inner citadel's current, towered outline truly belongs to that early phase. Some of the inscription stones differ in size and character from the lowest blocks, which complicates the picture. From that king onward, projecting wall segments became a defining element of Urartian fortress architecture. They appear not only on the outer walls of major northern cities founded in the Caucasus region, but also around the planned settlements established by later rulers. Under a subsequent king at Çavuştepe, this feature turns into a consistent style. Projections are not limited to the outer enceinte. They also appear on walls enclosing the main palace area, and even in the boundary walls around the temple. A similar solution has been noted at Armavir as well. In the final phase of Urartian architecture, represented at sites such as Khamir Blur and Bastam in the later 7th century, this projecting style reaches its most elaborate form. Large rectangular towers become common. They stand along the outer walls, and they sometimes appear as internal supports within the citadel. Zigzag wall lines remain frequent, combining with the tower system to create a fortress silhouette that looks both defensive and carefully staged. Gateways crowned by towers are also known from these late centres, giving the entrances a monumental, controlled character. Parts of the upper fortresses that no longer survive on the ground can be reconstructed through surviving images and miniature models. Decorative metal pieces and carved architectural reliefs show buildings crowned with towers, arched gateways, and battlement-like elements. Foreign imperial reliefs sometimes depict only the outer face of conquered towns, offering a distant view. Local representations, however, often include details that imply closer familiarity. Windows, surface ornament, roof beams, and interior-facing features that are rarely shown in outside depictions. Across Urartian sites, construction relied mainly on stone and mud brick. At one major fortress, two kinds of local stone were used for foundations and for the lower bases of monumental walls, while the upper wall bodies were built from sun-dried brick made from earth mixed with chopped straw and water. Palace buildings could stand on tall stone bases, creating a clear visual separation between the durable, lower courses and the lighter, upper walls. Brick sizes followed standard patterns, alternating between square and rectangular shapes with thin layers of reddish clay mortar between courses. Wall surfaces were typically coated with plaster or whitewash, producing interiors and facades that once looked far brighter than the bare stone ruins suggest today. Wood was equally important. Timber beams supported roofs, but wood also reinforced walls as horizontal ties set within the masonry. The presence of large stone bases indicates thick wooden columns, suggesting spacious halls supported by heavy posts. Roofs were built in a layered system of beams, reeds, and compacted earth, a practical technique still used in parts of the region. Floor construction shows the same mixture of solid planning and local practicality. In a major temple hall, the bedrock was levelled with clay, then covered with plaster layers and a course of bricks. Above that, the finished surface was made of small wooden boards, fitted together like a parquet floor, creating a refined interior finish. Other temple floors were simpler, built from crushed stone layers topped with compacted earth. Inside palaces, wall painting appears to have been one of the most widespread forms of decoration. Unfortunately, most surviving fragments are broken and scattered, preserved only in a few key sites. Even in fragmentary condition, the patterns are clear. Repeated bands, rosettes, palmettes, bud chains, and fortress-like motifs. Some scenes show paired animals framed like emblems, while others include mythic creatures known from metal art. In a few locations, higher quality figurative fragments survive, showing animals and people with a lively, natural touch. Flocks, working oxen, a calf turning to scratch its leg. One striking image shows a galloping horse set against a bright sky blue ground. Other fragments hint at royal hunting scenes, including chariots and harnessed horses. A representation of the chief deity standing on a lion is also known from a temple context, reinforcing the link between palace art, religion, and royal power. Among the earliest structures that can be dated at the capital is a limestone block construction on the western slope of the Van Rock. It forms an L-shaped wall of large stones laid without mortar. A mud brick upper section, reported in early 20th century research, is no longer present. The corner platform has sometimes been interpreted as the base of a tower temple, yet this explanation is not convincing when compared to the usual placement and structural signatures of Urartian temples. Another suggestion proposed that the wall protected a water source for the garrison, but the topography does not strongly support it. What stands out, instead, is the way the wall relates to movement and access. Where it meets the rock, steps were cut into the cliff, implying a significant route upward to higher buildings. This arrangement feels less like a defensive barrier and more like an architectural threshold. The wall's outer face also raises questions. Its block courses retreat slightly as they rise, forming a surface that could be climbed more easily than a typical fortress wall. Combined with its position facing the lakeside, it suggests a different function. If the lake level once stood much higher than today, the structure could have served as a type of harbour platform or quay wall. A canal connection between the rock and the shoreline is also a possibility in periods when the waterline was lower. This interpretation gains weight when considering that, well into modern times, the lake itself remained a major route for travel and commerce in the region, linking Van to other centres more efficiently than overland roads. The inner citadel of Van rises at the highest point of the rock, shaped to the natural form of the cliff. Projections and towers align with the places where the rock itself thrusts outward, especially along the southern side. Later, medieval and early modern construction complicates the picture, yet the surviving masonry still allows the basic outline to be traced. The fortress consists of an inner and an outer wall system, both featuring the squared towers typical of Urartian design. The inner enclosure forms an elongated irregular rectangle, oriented north to south, with its entrance on the western side. The outer defended zone covers a much larger area, turning the central section of the Van Rock into a fortified platform. Defensive cuttings carved into the bedrock on both the eastern and western sides are still visible today. They were intended to isolate the fortress from approach routes and create barriers where natural slopes were not enough. A similar idea appears at Chavushtepe, showing that this was part of a wider defensive toolkit. In later periods, the western end of the rock was further enclosed, and the defences were extended to serve the protection of the town below. Along the northern wall of the inner citadel, several construction phases can be detected. The upper layers belong to later centuries, while the lower layers preserve Urartian work. The deepest course stands out through its massive limestone blocks, laid without mortar, resembling the technique seen in the early limestone structure on the slope. Because inscriptions are largely absent from the citadel walls themselves, exact dating remains difficult. Architectural similarities make an early foundation plausible, since it would be unlikely for a monumental slope structure to be built without a fortified summit above it. Even so, important questions remain unresolved. The exact architectural and functional link between the lower wall on the slope and the upper fortress core is still not fully understood. One carved stairway running from the slope structure into the rock reinforces the sense that a major entrance once existed here. In its current state, the lower wall gives the impression of having served as a monumental gateway leading into the fortified city above. Its possible role as a quay or harbour platform remains a compelling alternative, especially if it once met water or canal routes. Another layer of complexity appears in the reuse of inscribed stones. In parts of the northern wall, blocks bearing an earlier royal inscription were set into later masonry. These stones were bonded with mortar, indicating a period after Urartu, yet the text fragments align in a way that suggests they once formed a long horizontal inscription displayed at a lower, readable height. Their current placement several metres above ground level looks accidental rather than intentional, consistent with spolia taken from a nearby monument and reused during later repairs. The lower Urartian base likely carried mud brick walls above it, as was common in this architecture, but later rebuilding replaced that upper section with reused stonework from earlier monuments. At the current stage of research, it is still difficult to place the outer wall of the inner citadel and the eastern defences into a secure construction timeline. The main problem is simple. Within this architectural complex, no clear inscription has been found that would anchor those walls to a specific reign. Without such an anchor, the sequence remains uncertain. Recent excavations have, however, added new pieces to the picture. On the narrow western section of the rock, beyond the western cut in the stone, archaeologists uncovered traces of buildings. Only the lowest parts survived, where the structures sat directly on the bedrock, yet even these remnants are revealing. The layout points to rooms arranged in an organised plan and to a thick wall that looks more like the boundary of a major residence than a minor installation. This structure has come to be known as the New Palace. Because it lies close to the Hor rock chambers, it may have been built under King Argishti I, although certainty is not possible. Its position also supports a broader idea. Building activity seems to have expanded outward from a core area, gradually spreading toward the edges of the rock. In 1989 and 1990, another excavation zone was opened higher up, in the upper and middle parts of the inner citadel. The hope is that these efforts will eventually reveal the key official buildings of the Urartian capital. Among the most anticipated targets is the main temple of the state god Haldi, a structure mentioned in a text carved at the Tabriz Gate. If such a temple existed in the expected commanding location, it would have been one of the clearest markers of how the citadel was organised. For now, though, the broader layout remains frustratingly unclear. The overall plan of the inner citadel cannot be reconstructed with confidence. Scattered traces of walls and foundations appear in several places, but they do not yet form a complete map. In many areas, carved wall sockets in the rock hint at structures whose purpose is still unknown. Without a systematic, wide-ranging research program, any attempt at rebuilding the citadel on paper remains speculative. Much of what is still said about Van Fortress continues to depend heavily on the surviving notes from excavations carried out in 1939 and 1940, rather than on a full modern survey of the entire complex. The uncertainty grows even more in the study of rock-cut architecture and open-air cult places. Here, the evidence is thinner than in other areas of Urartian culture, and interpretation is forced to rely more heavily on careful inference. Even so, several rock monuments near Van stand out as solid reference points. Meher Kapu near Van, Ashrut Darga at Yeshilaluch, east of Van, and the Tebriz Gate on the eastern summit of the Van Rock form a functional group. All three carry inscriptions and belong to the reign of Ishbuini. Their form and setting strongly suggest that they served as open-air sacred places. The most important of these monuments is also the best preserved, largely by chance. It stands between Akapru village and the steep hill of Toprakale, in a zone later chosen by King Rusa II for a new royal residence in the early 7th century. Meher Kapu is carved into limestone rock as a deep niche, tall enough to dominate a viewer standing below it. Its face is framed in 3 layers, with an inner recess almost completely covered by a long inscription of 94 lines. Beside it, a broad terrace was cut into the rock, forming a flat ceremonial space. A second niche was carved into the terrace wall, shaped differently and divided by a horizontal ridge that survives only in poor condition. Above that ridge, a rounded hollow was cut into the stone. Along the base of the terrace wall, traces of a rock-cut bench remain. Stone steps lead upward toward the terrace, and under angled light, the lines of additional steps connecting the terrace to the main niche can still be made out. Because no single detail spells out the purpose of the monument with absolute certainty, its function cannot be proven. Still, the overall arrangement strongly suggests a ceremonial station. The terrace appears designed to hold ritual movement, possibly the final stop of processions bringing cattle and sheep for sacrifice. The inscription itself lists such offerings within the divine system, which fits the scene implied by the architecture. Ashrut Darga near Yeshilaluch follows a similar idea. Here too, a framed niche is cut into the rock, accompanied by steps that rise toward the cult space. The inscription is repeated twice, as at Meher Kapu, but it is much shorter and placed higher on the facade. Above the niche, the rock shows clear signs of modification. Wall sockets are visible, implying that built structures once stood nearby and were connected to the niche. Close to the monument, rows of rectangular cuttings are arranged at right angles. Some researchers have proposed that these cuttings were intended to hold stelae, but their shape and context leave room for doubt. The inscription at Ashrut Darga links this monument to the Tebriz Gate, where another niche with a simpler frame also bears a text. Both refer to the construction of a building described as a Suzi for the god Haldi. This creates a difficult interpretive problem. The term is known to refer to the standard tower-like temple form in Urartu, yet it is not clear how such a temple relates to these rock niches. One possibility is that a tower temple existed inside the city's fortified area, during Ishpuini's reign, even if no physical trace has survived. In that case, the inscriptions could mention the temple without the niche being physically attached to it. For Ashrut Dargah specifically, the temple might have stood on the ridge above the niche, within the Urartian settlement zone on the nearby hill. A direct connection between text and structure becomes more likely only when the inscription uses language that points clearly to the monument itself. That kind of clarity appears at Meherkarpe, where the text states that Ishpuini and his son Minua built this gate for Haldi. In that wording, the niche itself is treated as the sacred gateway. It reflects a wider Urartian mindset in which mountains and rock faces were not only landscape but part of the divine sphere. A formal temple inside the city and a rock-cut gateway on a mountainside could therefore express the same religious concept through different architectural forms. If the damaged inscription at the Tebriz gate has been understood correctly, it suggests that both a tower temple and a Haldi gate were established in front of the city. That phrase fits the Tebriz gate's location, not in the inner citadel but near the northeastern summit outside it, where the rock-cut monument stands facing the wider urban zone rather than the citadel core. Another key site should be added to this group, the Hazine Kapısı on the northern slope of the Van Rock. This monument belongs to a later phase, roughly half a century after the Ishpuini monuments. A broad terrace was carved from the natural rock, slightly raised above the surrounding ground. 2 deep niches were cut into the rock wall, one larger than the other. Both once carried inscriptions, but only one remains properly preserved. Along the left side runs a long horizontal groove, and a low rock-cut bench frames part of the terrace. The overall design points again to a sacred open-air setting where ceremonies and offerings could have taken place. Yet the texts associated with this place are strikingly different in tone. Instead of ritual lists or sacred dedications, they focus on royal warfare and political record. The main surviving inscription is a long campaign narrative celebrating King Sarduri II. This contrast creates a strong mismatch with the modern name Hazine Kapısı, since nothing about the exposed setting suggests protection of valuable stored goods. In fact, the openness of these monuments indicates the opposite. They were not defensive storehouses, but public-facing places meant to display authority, memory, or sacred legitimacy. Parts of the inscribed monuments found here were later damaged, and some pieces survive only in museum collections. Even the carved bases suffered destruction in recent times. Location also matters. Meherkarpe and Ashrut Dargah sit in open landscapes, one of them near a settlement, the other more isolated. Hazine Kapısı and the Tebriz Gate stand within the urban zone of Tuspa, yet outside the inner citadel itself. The Tebriz inscription even uses language, stating that a Haldi gate was built in front of the city, reinforcing that these places belonged to the city's public sacred geography, rather than to the protected summit. When these monuments are compared, their architecture looks closely related, even when their texts differ. The terrace layout and rock-cut framing at Hazine Kapısı resemble Meherkarpe more than they resemble the Hor chambers on the southern side of the rock. This is important because the Hor complex is different in character. It lies in a difficult-to-access position, naturally protected by the rock itself, and it feels designed to be guarded. A small rock-cut guard chamber reinforces that impression. Such features support the idea that Hor once served as a royal burial complex containing valuable offerings, unlike the open terrace of Hazine Kapısı. Rock-cut architecture in this landscape was not limited to sacred niches and tombs. Practical structures were carved into stone as well. In some cases, inscriptions help explain their function. Two fountain installations linked to King Minua are known, one at the capital and another in what is now Iranian Azerbaijan. In both cases, spring water was channeled for public use, resembling later fountain traditions. Over time, later building activity erased most of their physical traces. At the site in Iran, repeated inscriptions inside a carved niche describe the building of such a fountain structure. At Van Fortress itself, two matching inscriptions survive above a natural cave on the northern slope, describing a similar installation. A third inscription exists in poorer condition, partly submerged, and the location has not yet been fully examined. Cisterns also belong to this practical rock architecture. The large water systems at places like Çavuştepe and Davti Blur should be included here, along with smaller collection installations found across many Urartian sites. At Toprakale, tunnels lead down toward hidden caves. Their ceilings were carved in a rippling pattern to encourage water, seepage, and collection. In other regions, stepped tunnels cut deep into rock descend toward water sources, reaching impressive depths. A particularly well-preserved cylindrical cistern at Yeşilaluç shows that advanced water storage techniques were already known in the age of Ishpuini and Minua, confirmed by nearby inscriptions. Some building terms in the inscriptions remain difficult to interpret, even today. One of the most debated is the word used for major constructions praised in royal texts. For a long time it was translated in very different ways, including as a special temple type, or even as a palace-like structure. Closer examination of the context across the corpus suggests a more down-to-earth meaning. A pasture enclosure or animal pen. This fits the economic reality that herding was as central as farming. A major inscription connected to the cult of Haldi lists enormous numbers of animals being gathered, and then refers to the building of this structure. The text reads naturally if it describes a managed space for sacred herds. A serious complication remains, however. The relevant stela stands at a high mountain pass, near 3,000 meters, a place covered by snow and ice for much of the year. Such a location seems unsuitable for a permanent animal enclosure. A more likely explanation is that the surviving stele is one of several repeated monuments placed along the route to the sacred city of Musasir. In that case, the text refers to an enclosure located near the sanctuary itself, while the stele at the pass served as a marker on the road. Evidence from another similar monument on the same route supports this idea. If so, the animal enclosure would belong to the temple zone, where the sacred herds were kept, not to the frozen pass, where one copy of the inscription happened to survive. Another term that remains unclear appears frequently in texts, without being easily translated. It first appears in short inscriptions from Minua's reign, carved on stone bases, with no clear architectural context. A later text points toward a link between this structure and grain storage, and relief blocks from a site near Adil Shavaz mention its construction. Since these reliefs were found beside a major hall and storage areas holding large jars for liquids, such as wine and oil, it is reasonable to suspect that the word refers to a storage-related building type, possibly part of a broader supply system. Even so, the exact meaning remains unresolved. Beyond Urartu itself, a long shadow of influence can be traced into the architecture of the Achaemenid Persians. Once the standard Urartian temple form is understood not as the famous sanctuary seen in foreign reliefs, but as the tower-like building repeatedly named in Urartian texts, clear parallels begin to emerge. Similarities are not limited to square plans or projecting corners. Both cultures used a distinctive feature that looks like a window but is not a real opening. Framed false windows set into the facade. In Urartu, they appear in depictions on metal plates and in stone monuments at sites, like Çavuştepe. Because these elements often belonged to mud brick upper walls, they rarely survive in their original position. Still, combined evidence from models and relief carvings makes it possible to reconstruct advanced versions of these tower-like temples, including a plan with multiple projecting segments along the long sides. The same false window motif appears in Persian royal architecture, not only on tower-like monuments, but also as decorative elements in palace complexes. In these cases, the feature no longer functions as an imitation opening, but as an ornamental pattern. Another striking overlap appears in the battlement forms. The crenellations carved and painted in Persian settings match those seen in Urartian reliefs and bronze representations. Even iconography shows echoes. A specific royal hand gesture in Persian tomb reliefs resembles the hand position seen in a relief of a Urartian prince near Doğu Bayezid. Urartian tombs have been identified across almost the entire span of the empire's territory. Even so, serious scholarly work on them began relatively late, mostly in the early 1970s, with only a handful of earlier exceptions. By that time, many burial places had already been looted, again and again. That constant disturbance has narrowed what these tombs can still tell. Because objects were removed, contexts were mixed, and the original arrangement of burials was often destroyed. The first Urartian rock tomb to enter the history of research was discovered in the mid-19th century near the Aras River on its right bank, at a place known as Alişar in the Aida region. The tomb consists of a small antechamber with a ceiling shaped like a vault leading into the main burial chamber. The inner room has a flat ceiling and rectangular niches cut into its walls. Several notable objects were taken from the tomb and later brought to the Hermitage in 1859. Among them were decorative bronze elements shaped like a siren and a horse head. A small bell carrying an inscription of King Argishti I was also part of the group, attached to horse gear. Finds like these show how closely elite burial equipment and high-status metalwork were linked. Another tomb chamber was found and looted in 1905 near Guza, northwest of Lake Urmia. Its architecture is unknown because it was emptied before it could be studied properly. What survives from the discovery is a small set of bronze attachments shaped like horse heads, now scattered in collections, including one example in the Louvre. A few pieces of bronze sheet were also attributed to a late Urartian artistic tradition. Here again, the story is familiar. Objects survived, the tomb itself did not. Burial customs in Urartu were far from uniform. The range is wide, and many tombs were built to impress. The rock-cut examples at Van are central to this picture. They have been known for centuries because of their dramatic location. Yet they were interpreted in very different ways before archaeology offered firmer ground. Early descriptions spoke broadly of chambers, storerooms, hidden spaces, and large caves. Even today, despite the lack of perfect proof in every case, several of these rock complexes are best understood as royal or elite burial monuments. Behind the smoothed rock wall that carries the annals of King Argishti I lies the Horhor complex, often interpreted as the king's mausoleum and a burial place for members of the dynasty. The core is a main chamber with a flat ceiling, roughly 10.5 meters long and 6 meters wide, with a height of about 3.5 meters. 4 doorways connect this central room to 4 smaller chambers. Niches line the walls throughout, likely used to place burial offerings. In one of the side rooms, a deep shaft drops down for several meters. Niches cut into the walls of that shaft reinforce the idea that these spaces were connected to burial practice. Similar niche systems appear in tomb rooms, whose funerary purpose is not debated, including those at Altyn Tepe and examples near Yerevan. On the floor of the main room, 2 rectangular pits were cut into the rock. Their shape suggests they were intended for large stone coffins. In the side rooms, raised platforms reached by small steps may have served a related function, offering additional placements for coffins or burial containers. The design also suggests that the complex was not sealed after a single use. Traces of a terrace at the end of the rock steps in front of the entrance point to repeated access. That open area likely hosted ceremonies connected to funerals and later commemoration. The tomb wasn't only a place of deposition but also a stage for ritual activity. Below the larger Horhor complex sits a smaller rock-cut tomb reached by steps and designed with a simpler plan. It consists of a long hall, around 12.5 meters in length and 3 meters wide, with a ceiling just over 2 meters high. Along the north wall, 4 large niches were cut so high that they almost reached the ceiling, giving the impression of small side chambers rather than simple recesses. On the southern slope of the Van Rock, many additional small burial chambers exist. Some have been published, many only partially. One particularly distinctive tomb on the southeastern end of the rock seems connected to cremation. A rock stairway rises to 2 terraces at different heights. One terrace is deeply cut and framed above by a rounded rock face. A narrow entrance leads into a chamber with an irregular rectangular plan and a ceiling over 3 meters high. Rectangular niches dominate 3 of the walls. They are deep and tall, and they take up much of the wall surface. On the floors of these niches, small round holes were cut in 2 rows. Their dimensions and arrangement strongly suggest that urns were once placed there. Comparable features have been identified in other regions as well, including sites between Erzurum and Erzincan, and in the upper basin of the Murat River near Tutak. At Kayalidere, similar holes were found in one of the rooms of a larger tomb, and a stone bench there also held a rock-cut coffin. Evidence like this has led to an important conclusion. In several places, Urartian communities practiced both cremation and inhumation side by side. In a richly furnished tomb at Ida on the northern slope of Mount Ara, an inhumation burial and an urn holding cremated remains were found together. The urns were set into natural cracks in the rock and covered with large stones. At Altyn Tepe, 3 underground chamber tombs contained stone coffins and traces of wooden coffins, and they also preserved signs of cremation. In the largest tomb there, a finely carved stone coffin contained the well-preserved skeletons of a man and a woman. Osteological study suggested that the man was tall, while the woman was considerably shorter, and both displayed physical traits that researchers linked to broader Mediterranean and Afro-European patterns. Whatever labels are applied, the core point is clear. Elite burials could include multiple individuals, careful preparation, and more than one funerary method. Chamber tombs have been discovered at many major Urartian fortresses and settlements. Examples come from Palu, Kayalidere, Altyn Tepe, a site near Mazgirt called Kalakoy, and Kale Sangar in Iranian Azerbaijan. The Kalakoy tomb is especially notable because of its architectural details. It has 2 chambers. The passage leading in has a vaulted ceiling. Above the doorway, a projecting element appears alongside the ends of wooden beams, imitating timber construction in stone. Similar framing appears inside as well, where the main chamber connects to the side chamber. The stones are cut in a rougher, irregular manner, yet each short wall contains a rectangular niche, reinforcing the interpretation as a tomb. Decorative elements that mimic woodwork connect this tomb to other rock-cut spaces at Van and to relief material associated with Kef Kalisi. since the Kefkalesi reliefs can be dated to the reign of Rusa II. The possibility arises that such details could help date the Kalakoi tomb as well. An inscription of Rusa II exists beside the entrance at Kalakoi, on the left side. Its state of preservation makes it hard to read, and even when read, it does not clearly explain the tomb's purpose. Like the royal inscriptions near Horhor, it does not provide a simple label such as burial or memorial. What can be said is that it is not a campaign account and not a text about sacrificial offerings. It mentions different groups of people and professions, and it also names the sun god and Haldi. That combination could hint at ritual activity, yet certainty remains out of reach. Attempts to classify Urartian tombs have grouped them by complexity and setting. Large multi-room tombs are often associated with fortresses, with Van, Palu, Kayalidere, Altentepe, Kalakoi, Shirinlikale, Atabindi, Kale Sanga, and Farhad Zakasi, fitting this pattern. Outside major fortifications, simpler single-chamber tombs appear, such as the early example at Alishar and the looted tomb near Guze. Beyond rock-cut chambers, there are also burials placed in natural and artificial caves, where the dead were either burned or deposited without cremation. In the Patnos region, several necropolises combine multiple burial types in the same area, including stone-built underground chambers accessed by passages that were sealed with large flat stones. Some of these tomb rooms show building techniques comparable to those seen at Altentepe. On the southern slopes of Mount Ara, cave tombs with very rich offerings have also been excavated, expanding the picture further. To complete the view at Van, other rock-cut spaces on the fortress should be mentioned. Their location and similarity to confirmed tombs make it likely that they also served funerary purposes, even when direct proof is missing. On the southern slope, the Naft Kuyu facade rises 8 meters high, and nearby lies the Ishkale tomb. Some earlier interpretations labelled parts of this complex as early foundation structures, but the overall plan fits better with burial architecture. The Ishkale tomb contains 2 main halls and 5 side rooms, and the first hall has a dome-like ceiling similar to the chamber at Naft Kuyu. Farther east, on the same slope, stands another large tomb, known as the East Room. It has a grand carved facade, a large main chamber and 3 side rooms. Long steps descend to the entrance, emphasizing its monumental character. Funerary culture is also reflected in the jewelry and prestige items that emerge from many tombs, even when the burials were disturbed. Neck ornaments worn across the chest, heavy collars, and medallions are among the most striking. They were made in bronze, silver, and gold, sometimes with gilding. In the 1970s, illicit digging revealed a particularly rich group of silver objects. These were smuggled out and dispersed across the art market worldwide. 2 main categories stand out: bowls and small bucket-shaped vessels. The bowls vary in form, some decorated with raised patterns and simple rims, others more plain with lid-like shapes. The small buckets are among the most remarkable pieces. One example carries a gilded band in relief and shows a well-known Urartian scene. 2 bearded protective figures, wearing horned headgear, stand on lions and flank a sacred tree. Each holds a vessel in one hand and raises a cone-like object in the other, a gesture linked to purification or renewal. The same image appears repeatedly across Urartian art, including seal impressions, helmet decoration, and wall painting fragments from Altentepe. One of these silver vessels carries an Assyrian inscription that makes its historical position unusually clear. It states that Ishbuini, son of Sarduri, gave the vessel to a man named Inushbua. The text frames the gift as a gesture meant to strengthen loyalty. Because Inushbua's name appears, the context points to the later years of Ishbuini's reign, likely around the period when Minua began to share power. This gives the entire group a firm early date, making it one of the earliest, securely dated sets of Urartian metalwork. The most plausible origin is a looted tomb near Patnos, probably from the Lits area. Excavations in that region later recovered similar vessels in controlled contexts, confirming that such objects belonged to grave offerings. Bronze items circulating on the market also appear to belong to the same dispersed hoard, including small discs and horse equipment. Some interpretations tried to use the wording about Inushbua's treasure to argue for a period of independent rule, yet that reading is not convincing. The Patnos region remains the most likely source area for these pieces. Urartu is also known to have produced large-scale sculpture, even though almost none survives intact. Indirect evidence is strong. Assyrian records describing the sack of the temple of Haldi at Musasir list statues donated by Urartian kings, including protective divine figures and royal statues made of bronze, as well as animal figures and ceremonial groups. Relief scenes from the Assyrian palace at Khorsabad visually confirm such accounts. In those images, the temple facade displays statues, including a standing male figure in a posture of prayer and animal forms placed near the entrance. Another scene shows soldiers smashing a statue, a detail that explains, at least in part, why so little Urartian monumental sculpture reached the present. If large bronze statues were carried away and later melted down, the disappearance becomes easier to understand. Smaller bronze figures do survive and give a partial idea of the style, yet rare stone examples are also known. Before the discovery of a lion torso at Gavash, the earliest widely recognized stone piece was a basalt statue now in the Tbilisi Museum. It was found at Van Fortress during late 19th century expeditions. The statue survives in two broken sections, missing head and feet, yet its remaining height suggests an originally life-sized figure. The long worn beard marks it as male. The hands are pressed to the chest and hold objects that resemble weapons or ceremonial items. A long sword appears against the body, attached by a belt that closes with a ring below the waist. The details are carved in low relief, separating them from the body surface. Hair falls in waves onto the shoulders, ending in a set of curls. Because the head is lost, the figure's identity cannot be confirmed. It could have represented a king or a deity. The absence of the horned divine crown argues against a god, since Urartian representations typically use that symbol for deities. Some comparable wooden figures coated with bronze from Khmer blur show related features such as pointed beards and weapon belts, yet they also lack the unmistakable divine crown. The safest conclusion is that the category remains uncertain. In the landscape around the former sacred city traditionally associated with Musasir, there are also upright stone figures that resemble standing stelae. Their style differs sharply from the refined palace art known from central Urartu. Such monuments may represent local mountain traditions, rather than products of the royal workshops. Their existence warns against treating everything from that region as direct evidence for the court style. A clearer connection between elite burial architecture and figurative carving appears in a remarkable monument at Old Do-Bayazet. The tomb there was carved into the rock near the fortress and is supported by other Urartian traces in the area, including red polished ceramics, cisterns, and extensive rock shaping. The tomb is arranged on two levels and resembles certain rock-cut complexes at Kaya and at Van itself. This plan makes it stand apart from later Persian and post-Persian rock tomb traditions. The the most striking feature is the carved relief flanking the entrance. 3 figures form a scene. On the left, a person stands on a platform and extends hands toward an animal that resembles a wild goat common to the region. On the right, a larger male figure stands turned away from the doorway, facing the left figure. At first glance, the arrangement looks like a sacrifice scene, since such images are common in the ancient Near East. Yet important details do not fit easily. The animal seems strangely detached from any clear action, and Urartian texts describing offerings usually focus on sheep and cattle rather than goats. The scene may therefore carry symbolic meaning rather than literal ritual depiction. A related motif appears on a limestone relief from the village of Avolu in Iranian Azerbaijan. There, a winged protective figure holds a young goat in one hand and a plant-like object in the other, echoing the broader Near Eastern imagery of purification and sacred renewal. Even in that case, the exact meaning remains uncertain. Goats also appear in Urartian art in other contexts, including silver medallions from Khamir Blur and prayer scenes on metal ornaments from Toprakal, sometimes shown beside a praying female figure in front of a seated deity. The animal, with horns curving backward, seems to function as a sign rather than as a victim. In the Do Bayazit scene, the right-hand figure appears more likely to be a king than a god. The helmet resembles known Urartian bronze helmets, and the curved staffs held in the scene read more naturally as emblems of authority than as divine attributes. The left figure could be an attendant or successor, possibly linked to the deceased. The goat, however, remains difficult to interpret, and without an inscription the scene cannot be pinned down. Here, interpretation rests on analogy and careful comparison rather than direct proof. Much like the reading of the Hor chambers at Van as a royal mausoleum. In both cases, the burial function is plausible, yet the symbolic language of the rock-cut spaces is not fully explained. The Do Bayazit monument is not entirely unique. A heavily worn relief associated with a rock tomb was found at Malazgirt as well. Some scholars have argued that the Do Bayazit tomb belonged to a local prince rather than the Urartian king, since the royal dynastic tombs are expected at Van, and the rich architecture seems beyond an ordinary vassal. Yet the idea of an independent prince so close to Tuspur is historically difficult to accept. The relief style also lacks enough secure features to date it precisely. The helmet form suggests a broad window somewhere between Argishti I and Sarduri II, though such a stylistic estimate cannot carry full certainty. Another possibility, less often considered, is that the monument reflects an earlier local power before the Tuspur dynasty fully established its dominance, connected to rulers known only indirectly through later written traditions. In the last cultural phase of Urartu, a new artistic approach becomes visible, one that ties carved relief directly into architectural settings. The clearest evidence comes from works dated by inscription to the reign of Rusa II and found on the northern shore of Lake Van. Excavations at Kefkalesi, near Adilchevaz and high above the lake, uncovered part of a fortified palace complex. Its most notable element was a hall supported by square pillars. These pillars, built from basalt blocks, echo the square module-like plans used in Urartian tower temples, including the projecting corners that define the form. In a nearby hall, large square blocks were found, each face carved with an image of a fortress. The carving shows a fortified structure with multiple towers arranged around its sides. No doorway is shown. Instead, T-shaped openings appear, resembling the false windows known from other Urartian sites. Additional details such as projecting roof beams add to the architectural realism. Each face of the blocks repeats the same emblematic scene. Two protective figures stand on lions and perform the familiar gesture toward a small sacred tree placed in front of a tower. Above, birds of prey hold rabbits in their beaks and face a stylized symbol. Along the upper edge runs a single-line inscription naming Rusa II and referring to the construction of a building whose exact function is still debated. The problem is that the original placement of these blocks within the building remains unclear. Even the purpose of the entire complex is not fully settled. Other carved blocks from the same area can be assembled into tall stone panels that carry another version of the sacred tree scene. Here, the protective figures stand on a bull, framed by stylized trees. Another square block bearing an inscription of Rusa II appears to belong to the same architectural program. Reconstructions have suggested different placements for these panels. One proposal imagines them flanking an entrance on a facade. Another interpretation places them facing each other at the entry zone, with the figures turned outward and the inscription set to one side of the approach. Details in the inscription block support the idea that additional stones once completed the text, and that the carved writing continued symmetrically across the building front, resembling patterns proposed for the temple facade at Khamir Blur. This fusion of writing, relief, and architecture represents an advanced development of traditions already present earlier. Since Minuar's reign, long inscriptions were placed along walls and corridors in temple settings. Under Rusa II, the relationship becomes tighter, with sculpted stone blocks acting almost like architectural statements. Images, text, and building form combined into a single message. In Urartu, the monument seen more often than anything else is the upright stone stele. No other state in the ancient Near East marked its landscape so densely with visual signs of power. Even a much later Armenian historian, writing in the 5th century, described how the legendary Semiramis was said to have set up pillars across the Armenian land and had words carved on them to keep her memory alive. It is hard not to think of the many Urartian stelae that people could still see standing in place centuries later. Even today, these stones remain among the most frequent Urartian finds, scattered across the regions the kingdom once controlled. Most of these stelae were dedicated to Haldi, the central god of the state, and the texts usually present the king's works as something carried out under divine protection. Yet the practice was not limited to one deity. Some stelae were dedicated to the sun god, and others to lesser gods whose names appear less often in the sources. The pattern is consistent. A royal action becomes a public statement in stone. A fortress founded, a canal cut through the land, fields opened for cultivation, orchards planted, a new settlement organised. Each of these projects could be celebrated with a stele that turned the king's decision into a permanent mark on the terrain. When a region or a city was conquered, the first symbolic act could be the raising of a stele for Haldi. A few examples are especially valuable because they preserve place names and routes that matter for historical geography. One stele stood near the road to Kars, east of Erzurum, and it was set up after a conquest attributed to Minua. Another was erected along the military route that pushed into the Zagros, placed at a strategic point as if to fix the campaign line onto the map. There is also a striking exception near the Mura River at Palu. There, the text was cut directly into rock rather than carved on a freestanding stone, even though the wording still speaks in the language of a stele. That mismatch suggests a practical solution. The inscription formula remained the same even when the monument type shifted, and it is likely that an actual stele once existed nearby with similar content. Among the most influential stelae are those set in the Zagros, especially the famous examples known from mountain passes and caravan routes. their importance does not come only from what they say, but from how they say it. They were written in two languages, one belonging to Urartu and the other to a neighbouring imperial tradition. Because of that bilingual format, they became key tools for understanding Urartian language. At the same time, their location and content anchor research into two separate moments in Urartian expansion, offering glimpses into the late 9th century and the late 8th century as distinct phases of ambition and control. Steloi varied greatly in size and in how much text they carried. Some were tall and impressive, while others carried surprisingly short inscriptions for their scale. There was no single standard. The goal seems to have been presence rather than perfect proportion. The stone needed to be seen to stand as a signal, and to make the king's authority feel physically planted in the ground. One concentration of stelae is especially striking, near the northern end of Lake Van, close to the village of Karahan. Many stones were set up there by Ishpuini and Minua. Their original archaeological setting is no longer intact, yet careful study of the texts makes it possible to recognize repeated series, almost like templates, produced with small variations. The author name changes depending on whether Ishpuini or Minua speaks. The place names shift, naming specific towns or districts. The god addressed can vary as well. Despite these differences, the structure of the text repeats so closely that the stelae feel like parts of a planned program rather than isolated monuments. A curious feature appears in the wording. Even when the main speaker is one king, the name of the other can still appear in the final blessing formulas. That consistent pairing hints at how power was presented, less as a single individual acting alone, more as a royal house continuing itself across time. In the Karahan group, the reasons given for setting up stelae include the founding of new fortresses, settlements, vineyards, orchards, and also the creation of a facility whose exact meaning remains uncertain. It is described in a way that suggests something connected to herds and land use. The texts make these projects sound orderly, planned, almost administrative, as if the kingdom is turning open country into managed space. The same pattern shows up in other stelae dedicated by Minua to multiple gods. Here, the blessing formulas name Minua and also his son Inushbua, revealing a consistent political message. The monuments are not only about what was built, but about who is meant to inherit the kingdom under divine protection. When these pieces are placed side by side, one conclusion becomes tempting. The area around Karahan likely contained a stelae sanctuary, an open-air sacred zone where rows of stones stood together rather than as single monuments. A comparable arrangement is known from Altan Tepe, where excavations uncovered an open-air cult place with several stelae set into stone bases. These stones were not inscribed, yet their layout suggests ritual use. A rounded altar stood in front of them, and their proximity to chamber tombs led the excavator to connect the site with funerary cult. In a different region, near Yerevan, a large uninscribed stele stands in the courtyard of a sacred space today, though its original source is unknown. It may have come from a similar setting, another place where stelae were meant to be experienced together in an open area rather than read as single statements in isolation. Images on cylinder seals reinforce the idea that stelae could form part of ritual scenes. Some seal designs show rows of stelae or liquid offerings being poured in front of a sacred tree. These scenes have often been linked to funerary practice, as if the stele becomes a marker not only of royal authority, but also of memory and the dead. A written text from the northern end of Lake Van adds a concrete detail. In an inscription connected to Minua's building of a new fortress, the text describes a ritual obligation, When the time is right, animals must be sacrificed, and wine must be poured both at a rock-cut sacred niche and in front of a stele. This line makes a direct bridge between carved rock sanctuaries and standing stone monuments, showing that both could serve as focal points for offerings. Even so, the Karahan stelae do not automatically prove a funerary cult. Their texts do not clearly say that the stones belong to the dead. Another reading fits the evidence just as well. The repeated naming of successors in blessing formulas suggests a dynastic purpose. The stelae could be part of a royal strategy to place the next generation under divine guardianship in public, permanent form. In that sense, the stones become political instruments as much as religious objects, setting succession and authority into the landscape where everyone can see it. Seen from a distance, the larger picture becomes clearer. Urartu used stelae in more than one way. Sometimes they anchored conquest and geography. Sometimes they celebrated construction and the transformation of land. Sometimes they acted as cult objects in open-air rituals that involved offerings. In other cases, they appear to have reinforced dynastic continuity, turning the idea of inheritance into something written in stone. The same monument type could serve different cult settings and different rituals, depending on where it was placed and what the text chose to emphasize. From here, attention naturally shifts to another signature of Urartian material culture: bronze production. Alongside architecture, bronze work is one of the clearest expressions of what feels distinctly Urartian. More than a century ago, small bronze figurines found by chance began to draw European interest toward the kingdom. Today, Urartian metalwork remains a major focus of research, and it also captures public imagination. In recent decades, large exhibitions in different cities have brought together many pieces that would otherwise remain scattered. These displays helped define what is known, showing the range and technical sophistication of Urartian bronze art. A difficult problem sits behind that success. A large portion of bronze objects surfaced through illicit digging, especially from the 1970s onward. Many pieces entered private collections, travelled across borders, and lost all connection to their original find spots. When that happens, the most valuable information is not the object itself, but the context that disappears. Whether it came from a settlement, a princely tomb, an animal burial, or a temple deposit. Without context, dating becomes risky and historical interpretation turns fragile. Even with those limitations, the known bronze objects can be grouped by technique and function. Two broad production methods stand out: casting and hammering. Cast objects include small figurines of fantastic creatures, decorative elements that once belonged to wooden constructions, and attachments shaped like bullheads, or siren figures that were mounted on large cauldrons. Many of these were made using the lost wax process, allowing complex forms to be produced in metal. Other cast items include furniture, fittings shaped like lion paws, elements of stands and chairs, and large lamp supports that could reach human height. Weapons, arrowheads, pins, horse bits, and many other practical items also relied on casting technology. Alongside these, thin bronze plates and coverings appear in many types, often linked to religious context and decorative programs. In terms of use, much of this metalwork belongs to the world of war and display. Horse and chariot gear, quivers, helmets, shields, and other equipment that turned military life into a stage for visual power. When style is used as a guide, the beginning of Urartian art in bronze is usually placed in the 9th century. Many early pieces show clear similarities to Assyrian models, especially in how scenes of battle and royal victory are composed. One hammered bronze disc, thin and wide, offers a vivid example. It shows a chariot battle scene arranged in a circular design, divided into sections. The overall structure, the presence of a sacred tree as a central organizing element, and the way victors and defeated are staged all echo Assyrian art from the reigns of major kings in the 9th century. That resemblance raises a simple possibility. Either an Assyrian craftsman worked for Urartu, or Urartian artists deliberately borrowed an imperial visual language that had proven effective. The center of that disc carries a different symbol: a standing god within a winged sun, supported by attendants who hold the wings. The image seems to combine motifs that circulated widely in the East, bringing together the idea of a divine figure inside the winged disc and the separate motif of the winged disc carried by helpers. Compared with this dynamic early scene, later discs and many shield designs from the 8th and 7th centuries appear more fixed and repetitive. Rows of lions and bulls march around the surface in steady rhythm, forming an ornamental pattern that looks ceremonial rather than narrative. To understand whether such designs represent specific historical events or simply heraldic decoration, comparison matters. Many Urartian discs and shields share a similar habit of dividing the round surface into 4 sections and filling those areas with creatures, animals, and repeated emblems. This consistent geometry suggests that what looks like storytelling can also function as a formal design system used across different objects. Still, the early period's preference for battle imagery is unlikely to be accidental. The first phase of Urartian military success relied strongly on chariots, and early campaigns pushed toward the Caucasus and into fertile zones south of Lake Urmia. In that context, adopting the dominant visual style of Assyrian victory scenes may have been a conscious choice, a way to present Urartian warfare as equal to the great empire next door. Even when the composition follows Assyrian formulas, details reveal a local identity. The pointed helmets of the warriors are one example. Another is the depiction of chariot equipment that matches real objects recovered archaeologically. Some yoke ornaments survive as actual bronze discs with inscriptions, and they carry images tied to a solar deity. A god inside the winged sun, standing on a bull, holding a bow. The repetition of this figure across objects of one period suggests something close to an emblem, perhaps associated with the royal court of Ishpuini. In one group of finds, the decoration is unusually refined, with high-quality hammerwork and delicate, incised details. The central figure stands on a bull, framed by wings, holding plant forms in outstretched hands, while smaller winged deities wear horned crowns. The scene feels both ceremonial and symbolic, moving beyond simple ornament into a structured statement about divine power and kingship. Bronze plates found in recent decades often repeat emblem-like compositions or processions of animals and fantastic beings, almost as a rule. Yet some still preserve narrative moments. One long bronze strip shows a ritual procession emerging from a fortress, possibly connected to a festival or a ceremonial meal. Scenes like this hint at the world behind the objects, where religion, public display, and royal authority blend into a single visual language. A long-running debate emerges when attention turns to a specific category: cauldron attachments shaped like sirens or bull protomes. Similar pieces appear far from Urartu, in Italy and in Greek sanctuaries, as part of a wider phenomenon often described as Eastern influence in the West. Some scholars argue that 2 closely related groups can be separated, one Eastern and one Aegean, both rooted in a shared creativity. Others pushed for a stronger Urartian role, suggesting that many of the Western finds are outright Urartian products, carried along trade routes. Proposed pathways run from the Van region through northern Syria and onward by sea to the Aegean and Italy. Yet there is a hard geographical constraint. Urartu's western border in the 8th century was essentially the Euphrates, and there is little evidence for Urartian settlement or even Urartian finds beyond that line. That makes any simple model of direct export from Urartu into the far west difficult to sustain. Another approach proposed multiple production centres. In this view, similar cauldron attachments were made in Greece and also somewhere in the east, with Urartu as only one possible contributor. Some researchers shifted the likely eastern workshop zone toward northern Syria, arguing that Urartu's role has been exaggerated and that the style could have circulated through regional ateliers rather than a single national source. Still, another perspective defended an Urartian origin for the human-headed attachments, but allowed for Syrian participation in the broader production network. What emerges is not a single answer, but a picture of competing explanations, each trying to account for stylistic similarity, geographic spread, and the limits of what can be proven without secure archaeological contexts. Research on the bronze cauldron attachments has been shaped in a major way by the work of R.B. Wartke. He focused on a human-shaped siren figure held in the Berlin Museum collections and rechecked the object's modern history in detail. What emerged from that investigation changed the usual story. The piece was long treated as if it had come directly from the excavations at Toprakal. Yet the evidence shows a different path. It reached the museum through the London Antiquities Market. Once that is accepted, the object can no longer serve as firm proof for a local Urartian workshop in the way it once did. The familiar dating tied to a specific phase of Toprakal's history also becomes unstable, because it depended on the assumption that the find was securely anchored to that archaeological setting. Wartke's stylistic and textual reasoning pushed instead toward the idea, already defended by Muscarella, placing the most likely production centre in northern Syria. This shift matters because the broader pattern is striking. In the Urartian homeland, these cauldron attachments appear only rarely. The number of examples found in the kingdom itself is surprisingly small for objects that became so famous in modern collections. In fact, only one siren of this type is clearly tied to an excavated context from within the broader Urartian world. That single secure example came from a rock-cut tomb on the Iranian side of the Aras River at Alashar in a burial context rather than a temple or fortress. A second attachment from the same place took the form of a bull protome, showing that both the siren type and the bull-headed type could appear together in one funerary setting. For dating, what gives this tomb unusual value is not the siren itself, but another item buried alongside it. A small bell from a horse harness carrying a short inscription naming King Argishti. That bell reached the hermitage in the 19th century, and the circumstances of its discovery were recorded in unusually careful detail by a major scholar. Because the bell carries a royal name, it functions like a chronological anchor in a way the cauldron attachments themselves do not. At the same time, one fact remains hard to ignore. Across decades of controlled excavation in Urartian sites, no comparable siren attachment has turned up as a regular find. If these pieces had been produced widely for Urartian cult centres, it would be reasonable to expect more of them in excavated temple inventories. The archaeological record does not support that expectation. Within the enormous range of Urartian bronze work, another famous group demands attention: the bronze figurines discovered at Toprakal. A representative example is preserved in the Louvre, and it gives a sense of the kind of imagery that made Urartian metalwork so recognisable. The figurines follow a narrow set of types. Human figures appear, animal figures appear, and hybrid beings appear, combining features in ways meant to signal something beyond ordinary life. There are griffin-headed figures, winged lions whose upper body looks human, winged bulls fitted with a separately made human head in stone, and gods shown standing on lions or bulls. One standing male figure, often discussed in modern literature under the label eunuch, also belongs to this same limited repertoire. Nearly all of these pieces were said to come from Toprakale, and during the 19th century they spread into major European museum collections. Alongside the figurines, there were also many bronze elements that do not depict living forms at all. These were fittings, connectors, and structural parts, the kind of objects that make sense only once they are assembled into a larger whole. Using Assyrian throne imagery as a guide, Barnett attempted a reconstruction that brought these scattered parts together as a single object, the base of a divine throne, imagined as part of the furnishing of Haldi's temple at Toprakale. The reconstruction was bold, and it offered a coherent visual solution. It also raised a problem that still cannot be dismissed: chronology. The usual assumption has been straightforward. If the pieces were recovered at Toprakale, then the throne should belong to the period when Toprakale flourished. Yet a comparison with another Urartian site complicates the picture. At Khamir Blur, a city founded by a later king, archaeologists found objects that were clearly older than the city itself, including shields belonging to earlier rulers. That tells a simple story. Objects could be moved, stored, reused, and carried into new foundations. A similar process could have happened at Toprakale. A written document from Bastam strengthens that possibility by referring to a throne in Rusa Hinili, connected with a specific year and a specific action. The wording suggests a moment when administration and court life were being repositioned, possibly shifted into a newly organized urban center. In such a move, furniture, equipment, cult objects, and symbolic royal items would have been transported. In that scenario, the throne associated with Haldi could have been relocated as well, arriving at Toprakale from elsewhere rather than being created for the site at the moment of its foundation. At the present stage of research, stylistic study alone cannot settle these issues with confidence. The evidence base is still too uneven. Some spectacular objects, including large lampstands known from museum collections, remain difficult to place precisely in time when they lack inscriptions or secure contexts. One example has been connected to Minua, another to Rusa, yet without firm archaeological anchors, even those assignments cannot always be treated as final. Even after all of this, the material reviewed here represents only a small slice of Urartian bronze production. Many major categories are left outside the frame simply because the field is too large. Shields, helmets, quivers, and related pieces often carry inscriptions and have generated their own specialized scholarship. Figurines found at Khamir Blur and other sites form additional groups with separate histories. None of these objects should be treated as less important just because they are not described in detail here. Together, they reflect the wealth of major sacred centers. Places like Musasir, described in ancient sources as storing immense quantities of valuable offerings. A key attempt to organize Urartian bronzes by chronology, using inscriptions as the main guide, was published by G. Azarpai in the late 1960s. Since then, the bibliography has grown into a massive body of work. A glance at the catalogue of the Jerusalem exhibition alone shows how wide the debate has become, ranging from technology and style to trade, context, movement of goods, and the meaning of images. From that point, the focus shifts from objects to belief, because religion touches almost everything that survives from Urartu. The ties between material culture and worship appear in several forms. Temples and rock-cut sacred installations offer architectural evidence. Burial customs reveal ideas about death, honour, and ritual. Artistic motifs and symbols open another window, even if interpretations remain cautious. When discussing Urartian religion, what can be described most clearly is the official religion, the worship supported by the state, centred on the royal house, expressed through monumental building and standardised inscriptions. At the heart of that system stands Haldi. This god was not originally part of the older Hurrian Urartian pantheon in a simple inherited way. Before the Urartian state even formed, Haldi already appears as a divine element in personal names, and worship is tied to regions connected with northern Mesopotamia. The god's ethnic origin remains unclear. The main cult centre lay at Musasir, also known as Ardini, located outside the core Urartian zone in the Zagros region. Early on, there is no clear sign that Haldi belonged naturally to the Urartian people. Then, a decisive change arrives during the reign of Ishbuini. From that point onward, Haldi rises to the top of the state pantheon, and the temple at Musasir becomes one of the sacred centres that Urartu treats as its own. In the formal hierarchy, Haldi stands above Tesheba, the storm god comparable to the Hurrian weather deity, and above Sewini, the sun god. The best-known ordering of the pantheon appears in a long rock inscription at Meherkapur, near the capital. This inscription is attached to one of the most important rock sanctuaries and preserves an unusually detailed system of sacrificial rules. It specifies large numbers of animals assigned to Haldi, then fewer to Tesheba, then fewer still to the sun god. The scale of those offerings implies that the ceremonies were public and organised, likely carried out on the adjacent rock terrace prepared for ritual use. A similar ranking appears again in later temple inscriptions, showing that the same structure was repeated across time and space. The religious texts that survive most clearly are practical ones. Many are sacrificial regulations, building dedications, and offering inscriptions. One of the earliest known religious texts was written in Assyrian language and script, and is thought to belong to the reign of Sarduri. It is badly documented and no longer available, yet descriptions suggest that it contained ritual details, including actions that resemble older Mesopotamian patterns. Certain terms echo concepts known from purification rites in the broader Near Eastern world, even if the same usage is not securely attested in Urartian texts. Another possibility is that the text was part of a ceremony consecrating a fortress. Without the original document, only cautious reconstruction is possible. One of the earliest Urartian language religious statements comes from Ishbuini's Sole Rule. A short rock inscription near a gate installation praises the creation of a vineyard and orchard, then ends with a striking line. The king says he made the inscription for the Lord. Here, the word for Lord, known from Hurrian usage as well, appears in a way that is unusual. It is the one clear case where the term does not function as Haldi's title. That opens several possibilities. The dedication could refer to a different deity, perhaps the storm god, as in older Hurrian traditions. It could reflect a transfer of property in a formula that does not name the god directly. It could also point to a side of Haldi that is not only military but also connected to fertility and growth, an idea supported elsewhere by rituals tied to harvest and wine. Even so, Haldi's dominant image in royal ideology is that of a war god. In inscriptions, he leads the armies, brings victory, forces enemies into submission, and grants the king legitimacy. Royal titles repeatedly frame success as something achieved by Haldi's greatness, power, and favour. Construction projects of every kind, canals, cities, fortresses, temples, are said to happen through Haldi's command. Across the country, cult places dedicated to Haldi were established in several architectural forms. Tower temples, rock sanctuaries described as gates, elevated seats, simple houses of the god, and other local expressions. Stelae were dedicated to him across the land. Countless bronze objects carry offering inscriptions to Haldi, including shields, helmets, armour, quivers, lampstands, and even arrowheads. In that sense, Haldi's presence was made visible almost everywhere. The state's relationship to its chief god was so tightly woven into public life that describing Urartu as a kind of theocracy is not far from the evidence. Beneath Haldi in the official order stands Te-Sheba, the storm god. During a certain phase of Rusa's reign, cities were founded and named for Te-Sheba, signalling special attention to this deity. The most famous is the fortress city, known today as Khamir Blur. Another Te-Sheba city was established near Lake Sevan, matching the site known as Odzarbird. The privileged position of Te-Sheba is also confirmed in the Meher Kappa text, not only by sacrifice numbers, but by the broader list of divine and sacred centres. After the gods of Musasir, the text places the gods connected with the holy city of Kumenu in the Upper Tigris region, ahead of the gods of the capital. The sequence may reflect a remembered historical order of sanctuaries, where the capital appears as the newest centre in a wider sacred geography. For other gods in the pantheon, the evidence is different. Cities named after them are not clearly known in the same way, and even for the sun god there is no secure example of a city titled City of the Sun God. Still, stelae and inscriptions show that other deities received dedications. The sun god appears in this way. A deity associated with combat as an abstract force also appears. Local gods around the northern end of Lake Van had important roles in specific regions, and their stelae sanctuaries suggest locally focused worship, integrated into the state system. In other areas, local gods were associated with rock sanctuaries, described as gates, linking regional religion to the same sacred architecture used for Haldi. Temple building was not limited to Haldi. A tower temple could be built for a local god north of the Aras River. Another could be dedicated to the deity of a particular fortress. The pattern suggests that no single temple form belonged exclusively to Haldi. Rock gates and stelae sanctuaries could also serve other gods. Musasir remained unique as a sacred centre closely tied to Haldi and his divine partner. Yet that uniqueness likely reflects the special status of the sanctuary as a whole rather than a single architectural blueprint. Haldi's divine partner appears under several names in the sources, and the identification is complex. The list of goddesses at Meher Kappa begins with her, and the sacrifices assigned to the female figures differ in type from those assigned to male gods. A second goddess name has been read in different ways over time, once linked to the storm god's spouse by comparison with Hurrian tradition, then reconsidered after closer reading of the original inscription. The third goddess is often treated as the counterpart to the male triad, assumed to be paired with the sun god, and sometimes linked in interpretation to the name of the capital itself. These connections remain debated, showing how uncertain the study of divine names and roles can be when texts are limited and later readings disagree. The sacrifice list also includes the moon god, though in a secondary position. Another important feature of the pantheon is the presence of sacred mountains and landscapes treated as divine beings. Certain mountains near Van appear as gods. A mountain between Musasir and Assyria is treated the same way. Another mountain facing Toprakale appears in the list. Gods of countries, gods of passes, gods of lakes, and the mountains themselves are treated as sacred powers. Alongside these are abstract divine qualities that function almost like independent beings. Haldi's greatness, Haldi's weapons, Haldi's warriors. Sacrifices could be offered even to these aspects, showing a religious vocabulary that could turn attributes into sacred realities. Religious blending in Urartu shows itself not only through the absorption of local deities in conquered regions, but also through the practice of offering to gods of multiple holy cities. Musasir, Kumenu, the capital, and other centres appear together in sacrificial frameworks. The Meher Karpu sanctuary reveals another layer at the end of its text, where ritual rules follow a seasonal rhythm like a sacred calendar. Offerings are tied to harvest moments: fruit gathering, grape harvest, pressing of grapes, and the pouring of wine. A related inscription elsewhere becomes even more concrete, demanding sacrifices and wine libations both at a rock sanctuary and before a stele. Archaeology provides a physical parallel at Altyn Tepe, where an open-air cult place included uninscribed stele and a rounded altar that looks designed for liquid offerings. Similar libation scenes appear on seals, suggesting that these acts were part of common ritual knowledge. Ancient narrative sources also confirm the existence of rich libation equipment in major sanctuaries. Descriptions of Musasir speak of large bronze vessels used for wine offerings, presenting the temple not only as a religious centre, but as a storehouse of valuable metal goods accumulated across generations. Nearly every monumental inscription carries curses aimed at future destroyers or usurpers, and these too belong to the religious world. The texts call on the gods to wipe out the offender and erase the offender's line. Alongside curses are formulas asking for health, protection, strength, and joy. Some inscriptions even describe the gods granting the king countless joyful days, presenting royal prosperity as a reward for devotion. The visual identification of Urartian gods remains one of the most difficult problems. Art depicts gods and spirits as human-like figures wearing horned crowns. They may stand on animals or hybrid creatures, or appear within a winged sun hovering in the air. It has often seemed natural to connect Haldi with the lion, Te-Sheba with the bull, and the sun god with the winged solar symbol. Yet as more material has been collected, simple identifications have become harder to defend. Similar figures appear on different animals, and different divine or protective beings can share the same animal base. Early bronze objects from the period of Ishpuini and Minua show a particularly consistent motif: a god within the winged sun. That may point toward Haldi, yet it cannot be proven beyond doubt, especially because the motif also appears earlier in contexts, shaped heavily by Assyrian iconography, at a time when Haldi's cult had not yet become fully established in Urartu. Some scholars have proposed that Haldi was worshipped without a fixed image, or that the god's presence was represented symbolically, even imagined as an empty chariot. That idea grew partly from how a key term in royal inscriptions was translated. If the term refers to a chariot, then the standard formula describing Haldi going at the head of the army could be read in a literal, visual way. If the term instead means a weapon, then the formula points to divine military power rather than a specific vehicle. The linguistic evidence strongly supports the weapon meaning, making the chariot-based interpretation less convincing. Still, the debate shows how a single translation choice can reshape the entire understanding of ritual imagery. Other proposals attempt more careful identification by combining images, inscriptions, and historical context. A bull-associated god within the winged sun has been interpreted as the storm god. A horned figure standing on a bull at a temple entrance has been interpreted either as the storm god or as a protective spirit guarding the gate. The presence of paired figures at entrances supports the guardian reading, since gate protectors often come in symmetrical pairs. A winged horse carrying an archer-like deity has been interpreted as the sun god in one approach, while a seal impression has been used to argue for an image of the moon god. None of these identifications is universally accepted, and the safest conclusion remains that the iconography cannot yet be locked into a fixed chart. One more pattern stands out. These divine and ritual scenes appear most often on portable objects: horse gear, chariot fittings, belts, plaques, breastplates, and wall paintings. They appear far less often in stone sculpture. That imbalance suggests that much of Urartian religious imagery lived in motion, carried by people, worn on bodies, displayed in processions, and used in ceremonies rather than carved permanently into public monuments. A rock relief near Do Bayazit, for example, shows a king and another figure, yet the second figure is not clearly a god, reminding us that royal representation in stone did not always mirror the portable religious world of bronze. A large group of bronze plaques found in later decades belongs to a different environment from the polished court metalwork. Their style is often rougher and more simplified, with varied themes that feel closer to everyday devotion. These pieces seem to come from non-official religious practice. One common composition shows a winged deity standing on an animal, facing a veiled woman in long clothing. Objects such as a cup, a sacrificial animal, or a branch appear as offerings. Some plaques show two female figures. Others depict more complex scenes: ritual meals, sacrifice events, or standard bearers accompanied by a young animal. Another group shows worshippers with raised hands, frozen in the posture of prayer. These figures likely represent the donors themselves. This material points toward a religious background different from the state's monumental language. Official symbols and ideas appear, yet they blend into a more local, less standardized system that is harder to explain. It is not accidental that such plaques do not appear in the great temple excavations of Urartu. Their modern history also complicates everything. Nearly all of them come from illicit digging, which removes the very information needed to map popular cult places and community rituals. Even so, their existence suggests a living layer of belief beneath the royal program, a form of devotion expressed through small offerings and personal images. The quality of a few plaques shows that this was not only the world of the poor. Some donors clearly had refined taste and access to skilled makers.